The wind in late spring still carried the memory of winter. It was a knife honed on distant peaks, slicing across the high meadows of Colorado and rattling the bare branches of the willows that gave the creek its name. Patches of old snow clung stubbornly to the shaded hollows, stark white against the dun-colored grass. Meltwater, cold and clear, trickled down from the hillsides, feeding the gurgling stream that ran past Jack Turner's small cabin. The sound of it was a constant, lonely murmur, a counterpoint to the silence that had filled his life for 3 months. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, soured milk, and a father's despair. Jack stood by the hearth, staring into the weak flames that licked half-heartedly at a log. The fire was like his hope, sputtering and threatening to die out. He was a broad-shouldered man, his hands calloused from years of working the land, but he felt as frail as a newborn. His daughter, Lily, was the source of his anguish. She lay in a makeshift cradle near the fire, her tiny body rigid, her cries thin and reedy, the sound tearing through the quiet of the room and the quiet of his heart. He had tried everything. For a week, since his last neighbor had moved on to chase rumors of gold, he had been trying to coax Lily to take the goat's milk. He had warmed it, sweetened it with a drop of molasses, even tried to fashion a teat from a piece of soft leather. But she would have none of it. She would turn her head, her rosebud mouth clamped shut, and her cries would escalate into a frantic wail that promised nothing but exhaustion and defeat. The she-goat, tethered outside, bleated in sympathy or perhaps in protest. Jack ran a hand through his unkempt hair. He was tired down to his bones. He saw his late wife, Mary, in every corner of the small room. He saw her in the neat stack of quilts on their bed, in the chipped blue pitcher on the dry sink. And most of all, he saw her in the broken rocking chair that sat near the hearth. One of its rockers had split clean through just a week before she had passed, and he had not found the heart to fix it. It listed to one side. A crippled thing, a perfect monument to his fractured family. Mary would have known what to do. She would have hummed a low tune, her touch gentle and sure, and Lily would be quiet and content. But Mary was gone, taken by the fever that had swept through after the baby's birth, leaving him with a child he loved more than his own life and a complete, terrifying ignorance of how to keep her in it. The self-blame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. A man was supposed to provide, to protect. He could build a fence, break a horse, and plow a straight furrow. He could read the sky for weather and the ground for water, but he could not make his own daughter eat. The thought was a fresh stab of grief. He was failing her. He was failing Mary's memory. Lily's cries hitched, a brief pause for breath before they began anew. Weaker this time, a new kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his fatigue. He looked from his daughter's flushed face to the window, where the gray sky promised more foul weather. He was alone. The town of Dry Willow was a 2-hour ride away, and there was no one in between. The thought of making that journey with a starving infant in this weather was madness, but the thought of staying here, watching her fade, was worse. He made a decision born of pure desperation. He went to the small table where Mary had kept her sewing basket and found a scrap of brown wrapping paper. With a piece of charcoal from the hearth, his large hands clumsy, he wrote. The letters were stark and blocky. Help, baby needs milk, a wet nurse, will pay, Turner Ranch. The words shamed him. They felt like an admission of his own uselessness, a public declaration of his failure as a man and a father. He had never asked for help in his life. But this was not for him. This was for Lily. He folded the small paper and walked to the door, pulling on his heavy coat. The wind tore at him the moment he stepped outside, whipping his hair across his face. He strode to the wooden post that marked the turnoff to his property from the main track, a road that saw maybe one traveler a day, if he was lucky. Using a nail he pulled from his pocket, he secured the paper to the post, hammering it in with the butt of his hunting knife. It flapped in the wind, a tiny flag of surrender. As he walked back to the cabin, the sky, which had been threatening all morning, finally broke. It was not rain that fell, but ice. Small, hard pellets of hail began to ping against the cabin's roof, first sporadically, then in a steady, drumming roar. The world outside the window dissolved into a gray, bouncing sheet. The hailstorm was a final, brutal statement from a land that did not care for a man's troubles. Jack closed the door, shutting out the storm's fury but finding no peace within. The noise of the hail was a deafening backdrop to Lily's now whimpering cries. He picked her up, her body feeling impossibly light, and held her against his chest, rocking her with a useless, gentle motion. He felt the last of his strength draining away. There was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for a miracle, or wait for the end. An hour passed. The hail lessened, turning to a cold, sleety rain. Lily had cried herself into a fitful, shallow sleep. Jack sat in his straight-back chair, watching her chest for the tiny rise and fall, his mind a numb blank. Then came a sound that did not belong to the storm, a soft, hesitant knocking at the door. Jack froze. He thought he had imagined it. The sound came again, a little louder this time. A fist, not just knuckles. He gently laid Lily back in her cradle and walked to the door, his heart thudding a heavy, uncertain rhythm. He lifted the latch and pulled the heavy plank door inward. A woman stood on his porch. She was drenched, her dark shawl plastered to her shoulders and her brown dress dark with rain. Her face was pale and thin, framed by wet strands of dark hair that had escaped her bun. He recognized her, vaguely. She was the widow from the Silver Ace mine, the one whose husband had died in a cave in that winter. Maggie Rowe. He had seen her in town a few times, a quiet, shadow-like figure who never met anyone's gaze. Her eyes, wide and dark, were fixed not on his face, but on the cradle by the fire. "I saw your note," she said. Her voice was low, and it seemed to cost her an effort to speak. The paper was soaked through, but I could read the words." Jack just stared, unable to form a reply. He was a man of few words on the best of days, and this was far from the best. She took a half-step forward, her gaze still locked on the cradle. "Is that the baby?" He nodded, his throat tight. Maggie looked at him then, and for the first time he saw the raw, bottomless grief in her eyes. It was a mirror of his own, but different somehow. Older, deeper. "I can help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. My own boy. He was born and passed in the same winter. I still have my milk." The words hung in the air between them, plain and devastating. He understood. The Silver Ace tragedy had left more than one ghost. He saw the flicker of pain on her face as she said it, the involuntary press of a hand to her flat stomach. He felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar, a sorrow that was not his own but that he recognized all the same. But his own desperation was sharper. He stepped back, a silent invitation. "Please," it was the only word he could manage. Maggie entered the cabin, bringing a chill and the damp smell of the storm with her. She shrugged off her wet shawl, hanging it on a peg by the door with an economy of motion that spoke of long habit. She did not look around the messy, grim room. Her focus was entirely on the cradle. As she approached, Lily stirred, her small face wrinkling as she prepared to cry again. Maggie knelt. She did not reach for the baby immediately. She just watched her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Jack stood by the door, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He was handing his child, his whole world, over to a stranger. The town's gossips would have a field day with this. The preacher, with his stern pronouncements on propriety and God's will, would surely have something to say. And what would Maggie's own reputation suffer? A young widow moving into a widower's home to nurse his child. He felt a wave of guilt for what he was asking of her. But then Maggie looked up at him, her eyes clear. "May I?" He nodded again, a dumb animal, with a tenderness that made his throat ache. Maggie scooped Lily from the cradle. She sat in the straight-back chair, the one Jack had just vacated, and unbuttoned the front of her damp dress. There was no shame in the movement, only a simple, profound purpose. She settled Lily against her breast, guiding her. For a moment, nothing happened. Lily fussed, turning her head away just as she had from the goat's milk. Jack's heart sank. It was no use. Nothing was of any use. But Maggie was patient. She murmured something soft, too low for him to hear, and gently stroked Lily's cheek. She tried again. This time, after a moment of hesitation, the baby latched on. The silence that followed was absolute. The storm outside seemed to fade away. The crackle of the fire, the creak of the floorboards, everything ceased. The only sound in the entire world was the soft, rhythmic suckling of his daughter. It was the most beautiful sound Jack had ever heard. He watched, his breath caught in his chest. He saw the tension leave Lily's small body. He saw her tiny fists, which had been clenched in hunger, slowly uncurl. A profound, bone-deep relief washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Tears pricked his eyes, and he turned away, ashamed of his own emotion. He busied himself with the fire, adding a fresh log, though it did not need one. He was giving her privacy, giving himself a moment to collect the shattered pieces of his composure. When he turned back, Maggie was still sitting in the chair, her head bent over his daughter. Her eyes were closed, and a single tear was tracing a path down her pale cheek. He did not know if it was a tear of sorrow for the child she had lost, or one of solace for the one she now held. Perhaps it was both. In that silent, suspended moment, with the storm whispering outside and a stranger feeding his child, a tiny, fragile warmth began to push back against the cold. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, something that came before it. It was the simple, undeniable fact of survival. Lily was eating. She would live through the night. A flame had been lit in the desolate cabin, and for now, it was enough. The new arrangement began in silence. There was no discussion, no formal agreement. Maggie had stayed the night, sleeping in the straight-backed chair with Lily in her arms, and when Jack had woken before dawn to stoke the fire, she was already awake, her dark eyes watching the embers. A silent understanding passed between them. The crisis had passed, but the need remained. He made coffee, strong and black, and fried bacon. They ate without speaking, the quiet broken only by Lily's soft coos and the sizzle of the fat in the pan. The cabin felt different with her in it. The silence was no longer empty, it was full of a shared, unspoken purpose. After he had finished, Jack stood and gestured toward the small, sturdy building next to the cabin. "The old storage shed," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's dry. I can clean it out for you." Maggie looked from him to the shed and back again, a flicker of something, perhaps relief, in her eyes. It was a proper offer, a way to maintain a sliver of decency in an impossible situation, a way for them to live near one another without truly living together. "Thank you," she said softly. He spent the morning working on the shed. It was not a large space, smelling of old leather, dried herbs, and dust. He swept the floor clean, his broom raising clouds of forgotten memories. He took down a set of old harnesses and wiped the shelves. One of the small window panes was cracked, a spider web of lines distorting the view of the mountains. He rode into Dry Willow that afternoon, Lily's soft weight a constant, warm presence in the sling Maggie had fashioned for him. He avoided the general store, heading straight for the smithy to get a new pane of glass. He felt the town's eyes on him, but he kept his own gaze fixed straight ahead. When he returned, he carefully replaced the glass, sealing it against the wind. Maggie watched him from the cabin doorway, a small, still figure. Later, when he noticed the shed door's iron hinge was rusted and squealed with every movement, he took it off, cleaned it with sand and oil until it was black and smooth, and reset it. It now swung open with a quiet, satisfying weight. These were the only words of gratitude he knew how to speak. In the evenings, after the chores were done and Lily was asleep in her cradle, a routine formed. Maggie would come into the main cabin, and they would sit by the fire. Two silent figures wrapped in the flickering orange light. Their shadows danced on the rough log walls, large and distorted. Two lonely shapes drawn together by a shared warmth. For many nights, they said little. The silence was a comfortable blanket, a respite from a world that demanded too much. But slowly, like a frozen river beginning to thaw, words began to trickle between them. One evening, watching the flames, Jack spoke of his wife. "Mary," he began, his voice low. "She had a way with horses. Better than me. She could gentle the wildest colt. Said you just had to listen to what they weren't saying." He looked over at the empty stall in the small barn, visible through the cabin window. That big roan out there. He was her last project, still half wild. Maggie listened, her hands busy mending one of Lily's small gowns. She did not offer platitudes or expressions of sympathy. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his loss, which he found more comforting than any words could have been. A few nights later, the conversation turned, ever so slightly, toward her own past. He had asked a simple question about where she was from before the Silver Ace mine. "A small town in the east," she said, her eyes on her needlework. "Came out here with my husband, Thomas. He was a good man, a careful man." Her fingers paused. He knew the rock. He knew when a timber wasn't set right. He said the new supports they were using felt light. She fell silent, and Jack did not press her. But he heard the unspoken accusation in her voice. He had heard the whispers after the mine collapse. The official report called it an accident, a natural shift in the mountain. But other miners, men who had quit or moved on, told a different story. They spoke of cheap lumber and hurried work, all under the watchful eye of the deputy manager, Owen Calder. A week after Maggie's arrival, their supplies ran low. A trip to the general store was unavoidable. Jack had planned to go alone, to shield her from the inevitable stares and whispers, but she would not have it. "Lily will need feeding soon," she said, her chin set with a quiet determination he was beginning to recognize. "I will not hide. I am doing nothing wrong." The town of Dry Willow was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, but on that day, it felt like the center of the world, and every window held a pair of judging eyes. As they stepped onto the boardwalk in front of the general store, conversation ceased. Women in bonnets stopped to stare, their whispers buzzing like flies. The Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was as starched as his collar, gave them a long, cold look before turning away. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured meat, and disapproval. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife and the town's primary source of news, gave Maggie a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mrs. Rao," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "how kind of you to be helping poor Mr. Turner in his time of need." The emphasis on the word helping was as sharp as a pinprick. Maggie did not flinch. "The baby needs a mother's care," she said, her voice even. As Jack was paying for the flour and beans, the store's bell jingled. A man stepped inside, bringing with him a puff of cold air. He was well dressed in a tailored coat, his boots polished to a high shine. It was Owen Calder. He was handsome in a severe sort of way, his face all sharp angles and his eyes a pale, cold blue. He surveyed the store, his gaze sweeping past Jack and landing on Maggie. He smiled, a slow, confident smile that made Jack's hands clench into fists. "Maggie," he said, his voice smooth and proprietary, "I am glad to see you are doing well." It was not a question, but a statement of ownership, as if he were remarking on a piece of property he had temporarily misplaced. Maggie's back went rigid. "Mr. Calder," she replied, her voice clipped and cold. She turned away from him, gathering the last of their purchases. Calder's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, a look of smug possession, before he turned his attention to Mrs. Gable. Jack quickly paid, and they left the store, the weight of the town's judgment and Calder's gaze following them out into the street. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Maggie stared straight ahead, her face a pale, unreadable mask. But Jack could feel the wall she had built around herself, brick by painful brick. That evening, she was quieter than usual, the small space between them by the fire feeling wider than ever. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the conflict between her gratitude to him and the shame the world was trying to force upon her. He could hear the unspoken words in her head, "I am not her mother. I have no right." He watched her as she held Lily, her touch gentle, her gaze full of a fierce, protective love. But he also saw the shadow of her own lost child, the constant ache of a grief that had no end. His own helplessness washed over him again. He could mend a fence and fix a hinge, but he did not know how to mend a broken heart. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that she was more of a mother to Lily in 1 week than some women were in a lifetime, that her presence in his cabin was not a source of shame but a beacon of grace. But the words were stuck in his throat, buried under a lifetime of masculine silence. So he acted. The next evening, while she was in the shed, he took a flat, smooth stone from the hearth, one he had placed there to warm. He wrapped it in a piece of an old flannel shirt and carried it to the broken rocking chair. With care, he wedged the warm stone under the shattered rocker, leveling the chair. It was a small, temporary fix, a quiet offering of stability and warmth. When Maggie came in, she saw the chair. She looked at it, then at him. She did not say a word, but a brief, fragile smile touched her lips before vanishing. She sat down, and for the first time, she was able to rock his daughter in Mary's chair, the movement a slow, soothing rhythm in the quiet cabin. The small, hidden warmth of the stone radiated through the wood, a secret comfort only they knew was there. That night, as she sat rocking, Maggie spoke of the mine again, her voice a low murmur. She spoke of the timbers, how Thomas had marked several with chalk, telling his shift boss they were cracked. Nothing was done. 2 days later, the tunnel collapsed. Owen Calder had personally overseen the delivery of that lumber shipment. The pieces were falling into place, forming a dark and ugly picture. Compassion for Maggie's loss began to harden into a cold anger on her behalf. A quiet sense of responsibility settled over Jack. This was no longer just about keeping his daughter alive. It was about protecting the woman who was doing so. Later, long after Maggie had retired to the shed and the cabin was still, Jack sat by the dying fire. He pulled a small block of soft pine wood from his pocket and his whittling knife. The motion was automatic, his hands needing something to do. Without thinking, he began to carve, the blade peeling away thin curls of wood. When he looked down, he saw he had carved a single name into the surface, Lily. He stared at it for a long time. It felt right. Seeing her name made solid, a mark of her permanence in his world. He turned the block over in his hand. The other side was smooth and blank. An idea, bold and terrifying, took root in his mind. His hand moved slowly, with painstaking care, the tip of the knife scratching out 4 more letters. Stay. He looked at the word, his heart pounding. It was a plea, a command, a question. All at once, it was everything he could not say. It was too soon. It was too much to ask. He quickly stood up, went to the small wooden desk in the corner, and pulled open the bottom drawer. He placed the block of wood inside, underneath a stack of old ledgers, hiding the word and the desperate hope it represented in the dark. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, marked by the rising sun and the baby's gentle needs. A fragile peace took root in the small cabin. Jack found himself listening for the sound of Maggie's soft humming as she rocked Lily, the chair now steady and silent on its warm stone brace. The air was still thick with unspoken grief, but it was no longer the suffocating blanket it had once been. It was a shared air, warmed by the fire and the presence of 3 living souls. He was beginning to forget what the crushing loneliness felt like. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, riding 2 horses that were too fine for the muddy track leading to his ranch. Jack was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a satisfying beat in the cool morning air. When he saw them, one man was large and florid, his city suit straining at the seams. The other was thin and wiry, with eyes that missed nothing. They dismounted and approached him not with the easy gait of neighbors, but with the stiff purpose of men who carried bad news for a living. "Mr. Jack Turner," the large man asked, breathing heavily from the slight exertion. Jack rested his axe. My name is Mr. Harris, from the Dry Willow Bank and Trust. This is Mr. Evans." The thin man gave a curt nod. "We have a matter of some urgency to discuss with you." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He was a man who paid his debts. His account with the general store was clear, and the small loan he had taken for seed last year was paid in full. "I have no business with the bank." Mr. Harris produced a folded document from his inner coat pocket. The paper was crisp and white, an alien thing in this world of dirt and wood. "I am afraid the bank has business with you." He unfolded the paper. It was a notice of debt, full of dense legal words that seemed designed to confuse, but the number at the bottom was cruelly clear. It was a sum so large it made Jack's breath catch. He scanned the document, his eyes searching for an error. His name was there, but the details were wrong. The date was from 2 years ago, the originating bank in Kansas. "This is not mine," Jack said, his voice flat. "Your signature is not on it, that is true," Mr. Harris conceded with a smug little smile. "But your late wife's is Mistress Mary Turner, as a guarantor for a loan taken by her brother, a Mr. Amos Blackwood." The name landed like a punch. Amos, Mary's brother, a charming, feckless man who had drifted from one failure to another, always with a smile and an outstretched hand. Mary had loved him fiercely, blind to the faults Jack saw so clearly. He had not known about this. She had kept it from him, a secret act of family loyalty that had now reached out from the grave to threaten his own. "Mr. Blackwood has defaulted," Mr. Harris continued, his tone devoid of sympathy. "And the note has been acquired by our institution." He paused for effect. "A venture our partner, Mr. Owen Calder, was most keen on." The name hung in the air, cold and sharp. Jack looked toward the cabin, where Maggie had appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Their eyes met, and in that instant they both understood. This was not a random misfortune. This was a calculated attack. Calder's reach extended far beyond the Silver Ace mine. This land was put up as collateral. The thin man, Evans, spoke for the first time, his voice like stones grinding together. "Half of it, the southern pasture." Jack's gaze shifted to the south field, the best grazing land he had, the key to expanding his small herd. It was the future. "We are prepared to be reasonable." "Mr. Turner," Harris said, adopting a friendlier tone that was somehow more menacing, "given your recent bereavement and new responsibilities." He glanced meaningfully toward the cabin. "We would be willing to forego immediate foreclosure. Instead, we propose a partnership. The bank will defer the debt in exchange for a controlling share of your yearly yield. A simple business arrangement." It was not an offer of help. It was a sentence of slow servitude. He would work his own land for their profit, a tenant on the very soil he had bled for. The anger that rose in him was hot and clean, but he held it in check. Lashing out would do no good. "I need time to think," he said, his voice a low growl. "The bank requires an answer by the end of the week," Harris said, folding the document and tucking it away. As he turned to leave, he looked at the official red stamp on the corner of the paper, a mark that seemed to Jack like a fresh bruise. The two men mounted their fine horses and rode away, leaving a trail of churned mud and a suffocating silence in their wake. That afternoon, the weather turned. The sky, which had been a pale, hopeful blue, thickened to the color of a lead ingot. The wind shifted, carrying not the promise of spring rain but the sharp, biting chill of the high peaks. By dusk, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the soft, fat flakes of a gentle winter storm, but small, hard pellets driven by a rising gale. The world shrank. The blizzard descended upon the small ranch with a wild fury, a shrieking white curtain that blotted out the mountains, the trees, and the road. It was a storm out of season, a cruel violation of nature's own laws. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, and snow began to pile in deep drifts against the door. The fragile peace they had built was shattered. replaced by the roar of the elements and the cold weight of the new threat. The storm trapped them for 3 days. It was a time of forced intimacy and rising tension. Their world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the short, perilous path to the barn. The dwindling supply of fodder for the goat became a constant, nagging worry. The goat was their lifeline, the source of the nourishment that allowed Maggie to feed Lily. Each bleat from the barn was a reminder of their vulnerability. On the 2nd day, a section of the fence bordering the south field gave way under the weight of the snow and the force of the wind, the posts snapping with a sound like gunshots. The broken fence was a stark, visible symbol of their breached security, their boundaries dissolving. Jack was quiet, but his mind was racing. He could not fight the bank with his fists, and he could not fight this storm with an axe. He felt the old, familiar helplessness creeping back in. But this time was different. He was not just fighting for himself. He looked at Maggie, her face etched with worry as she rocked Lily, and he looked at his daughter, so small and innocent of the forces gathering against them. His despair hardened into a cold, unyielding resolve. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, the world was transformed into a landscape of blinding white and brilliant blue. The air was still and friggly cold. The silence was profound. "I am going to town," Jack announced, pulling on his heaviest coat. Maggie looked up from feeding the fire. "I'm coming with you." "No, you should stay here with Lily. It is a hard ride." "And a hard conversation you will be having," she countered, her gaze steady. "You will not face it alone." He did not argue. He knew that quiet determination. He saddled his horse, the big roan, and Maggie bundled Lily into a cocoon of blankets, holding her tight against her chest. The ride was slow and treacherous, the snow on the track deep and unbroken in places. When they finally reached Dry Willow, the town seemed stunned and subdued by the storm's ferocity. Men were shoveling paths, their breath pluming in the icy air. The whispers started the moment they dismounted in front of the bank. This time, they were not just whispers. They were spoken in voices loud enough to carry. Outside the general store, a group of women stood talking. One of them, the wife of a deacon, saw them and spoke to her friend in a stage whisper that cut through the cold air. "There they are. He brings her to town now. Shameless." Another woman laughed, a short, ugly sound. "They say she is trading her milk for more than just a roof over her head." Maggie froze, her body going rigid. Jack saw the color drain from her face, saw the deep, hunted look in her eyes. He took a step toward the women, a hot rage building in his chest, but Maggie's hand on his arm stopped him. "Do not," she whispered, her voice tight with pain. "It will only make it worse." She turned and walked away from the bank, her back straight, her head held high. But he could see the effort it took. He could see the invisible wounds the words had inflicted. He watched her go, a feeling of utter powerlessness washing over him. He had brought this on her. His need had made her a target. He conducted his business in the bank with a cold, controlled fury. He did not beg or plead. He laid out his proposal, his voice even and firm. He would not sign their partnership agreement. Instead, he would use the entire harvest from the south field as his wager. He would plant it, work it, and bring it in. If the yield was enough to clear the debt, the land remained his. If not, they could take the field and the harvest with it. He gave them until the fall. The banker, surprised by his audacity, finally agreed. It was a gamble, a desperate play, but it was his own. The ride home was heavy with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of comfort, but of deep, shared pain. Maggie did not speak, her face turned away from him, hidden in the shadows of her bonnet. That evening, the routine was broken. Maggie did not come into the cabin after putting Lily to sleep. Jack waited, the minutes stretching into an hour. A growing unease settled over him. He finally pulled on his coat and went outside. The shed was dark and empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He called her name, his voice swallowed by the vast, snowy silence. He followed a set of small footprints leading from the shed not toward the cabin, but toward the barn. The large barn door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped into the cold, dark space, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals. He found her in an empty stall, huddled in the corner. She was holding Lily, rocking back and forth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The baby was asleep, a warm, oblivious bundle in her arms. Maggie looked up as he approached, her face streaked with tears in the dim moonlight slanting through the hayloft window. "They are right," she whispered, her voice broken. "I am not her mother. I am nothing. I am just the woman who feeds her." He stood there, his heart aching for her, the cruel words of the town echoing in the cold darkness of the barn. He saw not a woman trading her services, but a soul drowning in a grief so profound he could not begin to comprehend it. He had sought her help to save his daughter, and in doing so, he had led her into a new and different kind of storm. The seed of a desperate, impulsive decision had been sown, watered by public scorn and her own deep sorrow. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that something had been broken that day, and he did not know if he had the first idea of how to put it back together. He saw her words land in the cold air, saw them dissolve like frozen breath. They were not just an expression of her pain, they were a verdict she had passed on herself. Jack stood in the doorway of the barn, a dark silhouette against the vast, star-dusted snowscape. The moonlight cut through the gaps in the barn's siding, laying down bars of pale light across the hay-strewn floor, illuminating the woman huddled in the corner like a prisoner. Her grief was a tangible thing in the frigid air, as real as the ache in his own chest. He took a slow step inside, the heavy door groaning shut behind him, plunging the space into a deeper dark. For a moment, he was just a shape moving through the shadows, and he let the silence stretch, letting her know he was there without crowding her. He could have turned around. He could have gone back to the cabin, back to the fire, and left her to her sorrow. The old Jack, the man who had existed before Mary's death, would have. He had always been a man who fixed things with his hands, who met problems with silent labor, not with words he could never seem to find, but standing there, listening to the ragged sound of her breathing. He understood that walking away was no longer an option. Walking away meant losing this, too. It meant losing the fragile warmth that had seeped back into his frozen life. It meant losing the woman who had brought the sound of a contented baby back into his silent house. He walked toward her, his boots making soft sounds in the scattered hay. He did not stop until he was standing over her, looking down at the curve of her back, the dark mass of her hair, and the precious, sleeping bundle she clutched to her chest as if to ward off the world. "Maggie," he said. His voice was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the cavernous space. She flinched, pulling Lily tighter. "Go away," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Please, just leave us be." He did not leave. Instead, he slowly lowered himself, first to one knee, then sitting all the way down in the hay beside her. He did not touch her. He just sat, sharing the cold, sharing the darkness. He could feel her shaking, a fine tremor that ran through her whole body. "What they said in town," he began, his words clumsy, "that was poison. It has nothing to do with you, or with me." She gave a short, bitter laugh that ended in a sob. "It has everything to do with me. I heard them. They see me as a convenience, something you use, and they are not wrong. I let myself be used because I am empty. My arms are empty. My house is empty. My whole life is a hollow thing since I lost my boy." Her voice broke on the last word. I look at her, at Lily, and for a minute, I can pretend she is mine, that my Thomas did not die in the dark, but she is not mine. I am a fraud. I am stealing these moments from her real mother's memory. The depth of her self-loathing was a chasm, and he felt his own inadequacy in the face of it. What could he say, he, who had his own ghosts, his own failures that haunted him in the quiet hours of the night? He watched her for a long moment, the moonlight catching the wet tracks of tears on her cheeks. He saw past the town's gossip, past the awkwardness of their arrangement. He saw a woman who had walked into his life during a storm and offered him the one thing he could not provide his daughter. She had offered life itself. "You are not stealing anything," he said, his voice low and certain. She shook her head, a violent, negative motion. "I am not her mother," she whispered again, the words a final, desperate confession of her own unworthiness. It was the heart of her pain, the belief that she had no rightful place here, no claim to the love that was growing in her heart for this child. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower, forcing her to listen. "When you knocked on my door, Lily was fading. I had tried everything. I was watching my daughter starve to death in my own house." He paused, letting the brutal truth of it settle between them. "I had given up. Maggie, in my heart. I had already started to bury her next to her mother. Then you came. You took her in your arms." He looked from Maggie's anguished face to the sleeping baby. "You gave my daughter back to me." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. His words did not deny her pain, but they offered a different truth, a truth that was simple and undeniable. The cold was seeping through his coat now, a deep, invasive chill. He could see Maggie shivering, trying to shield Lily with her own body. Without a second thought, he shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat. It was his bulwark against the world, warm and smelling of wood smoke and leather. He leaned over and draped it around her and the baby, tucking it in, creating a small, warm tent against the cold. Then he shifted his position, moving to sit with his back pressed against the drafty wooden slats of the stall, positioning his body as a shield between them and the wind that whistled through the cracks. He was a wall. He was a shelter. He sat there, solid and unmoving, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. They sat in the shared darkness, wrapped in the warmth of his coat, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and Lily's soft, even breathing. The world outside the barn, with its cruel tongues and its impossible deaths, ceased to exist. All that was real was the cold, the quiet, and the three of them huddled together in a dusty animal stall. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigidity began to seep out of her. The tremors that had shaken her body lessened. Her ragged sobs subsided into a deep, shuddering sigh. And then she moved. It was a tiny shift, a movement of inches, but it felt as significant as the turning of the earth. She leaned against him. Her head came to rest on his shoulder, a hesitant, trusting weight. He did not move a muscle. He sat as still as a stone, breathing in the scent of hay and her hair. He felt the immense, terrifying weight of her trust. In that moment, he was not just Jack Turner, the grieving widower. He was a man with something to protect, a man who had been given a reason to be strong again. This was not about saving someone. He knew he could not save her from her grief, just as she could not save him from his. This was about sitting through the storm together. They stayed that way for hours, two lonely souls finding a fragile anchor in one another. The moon climbed high in the sky and then began its slow descent. He felt her breathing deepen, her body finally surrendering to an exhausted sleep. He stayed awake, watching over them, his own fatigue a distant thing. He was facing his own fear head-on, the terror of losing another family, and he was not running from it. He was sitting firm, a wall against the night. When the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the barn, he gently stirred her. "Maggie, it is morning." She woke with a start, disoriented for a moment. Then she looked at the coat still wrapped around her, at his solid presence beside her, and a faint blush rose on her cheeks. She straightened up, pulling away slightly, the familiar wall of propriety rising between them again. But something had changed. The haunted, broken look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary resolve. They walked back to the cabin in silence, their boots crunching on the fresh, crisp snow. The sky was clear, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Inside, the cabin was frigid, the fire having burned down to a pile of graying embers. While Maggie attended to Lily, Jack rebuilt the fire with a fierce, determined energy. He piled on the logs until a great, roaring blaze filled the hearth, chasing the shadows and the chill from every corner of the room. The flames leaped and danced, a vibrant, living thing, a declaration of warmth and life against the memory of the cold night. He made coffee and they ate a quiet breakfast. The silence was different now. It was not a silence of distance, but of shared experience, of a night spent in the cold that had forged a new and unspoken bond. Later that morning, after Maggie had taken Lily to the shed for a nap, Jack surveyed the cabin. His eyes fell on the broken rocking chair, a constant, nagging reminder of his broken life. He went to the woodpile where he kept the seasoned pine he had been saving to repair it. He picked up a solid, smooth plank. He ran his hand over the grain, but he did not take it to the rocking chair. He took it to his workbench. He found his saw and his hammer, his rule and his plane, and with slow, deliberate movements, he began to work. The sharp, clean sound of the saw cutting through wood filled the quiet cabin. He was not mending something old. He was building something new. He was building a cradle, a proper one, with solid sides and smooth, rounded rockers, a safe and permanent place for his daughter to sleep. As he worked, the words he wanted to say, the words he had carved into the hidden block of wood, echoed in his mind, but he knew they were not enough. A promise had to be more than a word. It had to be an action. He stopped his work and wiped his hands on his trousers. He went to the small desk, found a clean sheet of paper, and dipped a pen in the inkwell. His hand, so used to the axe and the plow, felt clumsy, but his letters were firm and clear. He wrote 2 short sentences. Stay. Not a helper, a mother. He folded the paper once and walked over to the half-finished cradle. He placed the note right in the center of it, where she could not possibly miss it. It was not a question. It was an invitation. It was an answer. It was a foundation, laid with wood and ink, for a new beginning. The note lay in the center of the new cradle like a seed planted in fresh soil. Maggie saw it when she came in from the shed, her arms full of clean linen. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The cradle itself was a marvel, its pine wood glowing warm in the morning light, the rockers perfectly curved, a testament to hours of careful work. But it was the paper that held her gaze. She set the linens down and reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. The ink was black and stark against the pale paper. Stay, not a helper, a mother. She read the words once, then twice. They were not flowery or poetic. They were simple and solid, like the man who had written them. They were not a plea for help, but an offer of a place. A real place. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, the paper a small, warm square against her hip. She did not say anything to Jack when he came in from the barn. Words were not needed. Instead, later that morning, while he was out mending the fence that had broken in the storm, she made 3 trips to the storage shed. She carried her meager belongings, a spare dress, a small wooden box of letters from her mother, her sewing kit, and placed them neatly in the corner of the cabin that had been tacitly designated hers. The action was her answer. It was a quiet declaration that she was no longer a temporary guest, a storm-blown refugee. She was staying. The south field became their singular focus. It was a broad, gently sloping pasture, its soil rich but unbroken. The gamble Jack had made with the bank was a weight on both of them, a deadline marked by the turning of the seasons. To fail meant losing half the ranch, the very land that was supposed to be Lily's future. For the first week, Jack worked alone, his shoulders straining against the heavy plow, the big roan horse pulling alongside him. The work was slow and backbreaking. He was turning over years of packed sod, wrestling with rocks and stubborn roots. He worked from sunup to sundown, his silence growing deeper with his exhaustion. One evening, as he came in for supper, his body aching, Maggie looked at the single furrow he had managed to plow that day. "You cannot do this alone, Jack," she said, her voice soft but firm. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say it was his burden, his debt. But he looked at his blistered hands, and he looked at her steady, determined face, and he knew she was right. The man who had nailed a desperate plea for help to a post was not entirely gone. He was just learning to speak his needs aloud. The next morning, he rode to the neighboring ranch, a small spread owned by an older farmer named Josiah Miller. Josiah was a quiet, decent man who had been friends with Mary's father. He found him sharpening a scythe in his barn. Jack dismounted. "Josiah." "Jack," Josiah nodded, not stopping his work. "I need help," Jack said, the words coming out harder than he intended. "With the South Field, the bank has a claim. I have until the harvest to pay a debt." Josiah stopped his work then. He looked past Jack, his gaze settling on the distant roof of the Turner cabin. He had seen Maggie in town. He had heard the whispers, but his eyes were clear of judgment. He simply saw a man in trouble. "My boys and I will be there at sunrise," Josiah said. "We will bring our team." He was as good as his word. The next day, Josiah and his 2 strapping sons arrived with a team of strong draft horses that made the roan look like a pony. They set to work with a quiet efficiency that shamed Jack's solitary efforts. In 2 days, the entire South Field was a canvas of rich, dark earth, turned and ready for seed. The work bound them together. Jack, Josiah, and his boys worked the fields, while Maggie managed the cabin, cooking enormous meals that left the hard-working men groaning with satisfaction. Lily, now thriving, would spend her days on a blanket in the shade, her laughter a bright, musical sound that carried on the breeze. A sound Jack realized he had never heard before. It was like a wind chime, delicate and full of life. Their next challenge was water. The spring was turning out to be a dry one, the rains sparse and fleeting. The creek that bordered the field, fed by the mountain snowmelt, was their only hope. They spent another week digging an irrigation ditch, a narrow channel that would carry the life-giving water to their future crops. It was hard, shoveling work under a sun that grew hotter each day. But the ditch brought a new problem. The creek water was full of fine sand and silt, which quickly settled in the channel, clogging the flow. Twice a day, Jack had to walk the length of the ditch with a shovel, clearing out the sediment. It was a frustrating, endless task. One afternoon, Maggie came out to the field, carrying a pail of cool water. She watched Jack as he worked, his face set in a grim line, his shovel scraping against the bottom of the ditch. "At the mine," she said, her voice thoughtful, "they used sluice boxes to separate the silver from the rock and sand. They would wash everything over screens. The heavy silver would stay, and the light sand would wash away." Jack stopped, leaning on his shovel. He looked at her, a glimmer of an idea in his eyes. "There is some old wire mesh in the barn," she continued, "from a chicken coop Mary was meaning to build. Maybe we could make a screen, a sort of sieve, to place where the water enters the ditch. It could catch the worst of the silt." It was a brilliant idea, born from a place of darkness but applied to a place of hope. They spent the evening working by lantern light, constructing a sturdy wooden frame and stretching the wire mesh across it. The next morning, they installed it at the head of the ditch. The effect was immediate. The water flowed into the channel clear and steady, the silt and pebbles collecting in a growing pile against the mesh screen. Maggie's knowledge from the mine had saved their crop. As the barley and bean shoots began to poke through the dark soil, a sense of cautious optimism settled over the ranch. But their small island of peace was not to go unnoticed. Owen Calder saw the progress on his weekly rides out from town. He saw the greening fields, the steady flow of water, and the 2 figures working side by side. He saw a debt he had counted on collecting slipping through his fingers. The trouble started subtly. The whispers in town grew louder, the lies more vicious. The story of the widow trading her favors for a roof over her head was now common currency at the general store, repeated with righteous indignation. Maggie felt the stares like blows whenever she had to go for supplies. But something had changed in her since that night in the barn. She no longer bowed her head. She met their gazes with a cool, level stare that promised no apology. Her pain was still there, but it was now shielded by a layer of hard-won resolve. One morning, Jack and Maggie awoke to find their work sabotaged. Under the cover of darkness, Someone had broken down a section of the ditch wall, sending the precious water flooding out over the unplanted ground. They found the deep, muddy prints of 2 pairs of heavy boots. There was no doubt in Jack's mind who was responsible. They spent the entire day rebuilding the wall, their hands raw, their hearts filled with a cold, simmering anger. That evening, as they sat on the porch, too tired to speak, watching the last light fade from the sky, Maggie made a decision. She went inside and returned with a small, leather-bound book and the inkwell. It was a journal she had kept, full of empty pages since her husband's death. By the light of the lantern, she opened it to a fresh page, in a neat, steady hand. She wrote down the date. Then she wrote about the sabotaged ditch, and then, her memory sparked by the talk of the mine, she began to write down everything she could remember Thomas telling her about the faulty timbers, about his arguments with the shift boss, about Owen Calder's involvement. The journal was no longer a place for sorrow. It was becoming an instrument of justice. Her voice, silenced by grief and intimidation, was finding its way onto the page. A week later, the true discovery came. An old corner post of the barn had rotted through, and Jack decided to replace it. He needed a sturdy piece of lumber, and he remembered a stack of old seasoned timbers that had been left behind by the previous owner, piled against the back wall of the barn. They were weathered and gray, half covered in weeds. He and Maggie worked together to pull the heavy beams from the pile. They were clearing the last of them when Maggie stopped, her hand resting on a piece of dark, crumbling wood. "Jack," she said, her voice a strange, tight whisper. He looked over. She was staring at the end of the timber, where a faint, stamped mark was visible beneath the grime. She knelt, rubbing at it with her thumb. The dirt fell away, revealing a set of letters and a symbol, S-A-M-S, with a small crossed pickaxe and shovel in the center. Silver Ace Mining and Supply. A sudden, dizzying wave of memory washed over her. She could hear Thomas's voice, angry and frustrated, describing this very stamp. "It is Calder's own supply company," he had said. "He is selling the mine its own lumber at twice the price, and it is half rotten to begin with." Her fingers tightened on the wood, and a piece of it crumbled in her hand, turning to soft, fibrous dust. This was it. This was not just a story or a suspicion. This was proof, tangible, rotting proof that Owen Calder had supplied the faulty materials that had led to the mine's collapse, the materials that had killed her husband and, in the bleak winter that followed, her infant son. She looked up at Jack, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. Her grief had found a name and a face. It had found a target. As if in response to their discovery, the sky itself seemed to turn against them. The brief spring rains ceased completely. The heavens shut themselves off. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down from a cloudless, metallic sky. The ground grew hard and cracked. The flow of water from the creek, their one lifeline, began to diminish, slowing from a steady stream to a discouraging trickle. The young green shoots of barley and beans, which had looked so promising just a week before, began to wilt in the heat. They were now fighting a war on 3 fronts, against the machinations of a powerful, ruthless man, against the poison of a judging community, and against the vast, unforgiving indifference of nature itself. The South Field, once a symbol of hope and defiance, was now a parched and desperate battleground. The sun became an enemy. It rose each morning not with a promise of life, but as a brassy, shimmering disk of punishment in a bleached-out sky. The earth of the South Field, once dark and full of hope, baked and cracked into a mosaic of thirsty polygons. The young plants, which had pushed up with such vigor, now stood limp and pale, their leaves curling inward as if in prayer for a deliverance that never came. The creek, their lifeline, shrank daily, retreating from its banks until it was no more than a string of disconnected pools, their surfaces reflecting the pitiless sky. Their days were a grueling battle against the heat, but their nights became a desperate, back-breaking ritual of salvation. After Lily was asleep in her new cradle, Jack and Maggie would go out into the moon-drenched field. The air was cooler then, but the ground still radiated the day's oppressive warmth. They worked with 2 wooden buckets, a silent, coordinated team. He would wade into the deepest remaining pool, the muddy water swirling around his knees, and fill the buckets. He would pass them to her on the bank, and she would carry them, her arms straining, to the rows of wilting barley and beans, carefully tipping a little water at the base of each plant. Then she would return with the empty buckets, and the cycle would begin again. It was a slow, agonizing process. Their world shrank to the splash of water, the squeak of the bucket handles, the soft thud of their own footsteps, and the sound of their ragged breathing in the vast, silent night. They spoke little, conserving their energy. Their communication reduced to nods and gestures, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of their shared labor. They were 2 small, stubborn figures fighting a war against an entire season, their only weapon a pair of buckets and an unwillingness to surrender. One night, the moon was a sliver, and the stars seemed impossibly bright and distant. The heat of the day had lingered, and the air was heavy and still. They had been working for hours, their movements automatic with fatigue. Maggie's back ached, and her arms felt like lead. She went to the creek bank, her feet sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth at the water's edge as Jack handed her the full buckets. She turned, taking the strain, her muscles screaming in protest. Her boots slipped on a patch of slick mud. For a split second, her entire focus was on the water. To spill a drop felt like a catastrophic failure. She twisted her body, trying to keep the buckets level, and threw out her right hand to break her fall. She landed hard, her wrist taking the full impact of her weight against the unyielding ground. A sharp, searing pain shot up her arm, so intense it stole her breath. A small, involuntary cry escaped her lips. The buckets clattered to the ground, their precious contents gushing out and soaking uselessly into the thirsty earth. Jack was beside her in an instant. The splash and her cry had cut through his exhaustion like a whip crack. "Maggie." His voice was sharp with alarm. He knelt in the mud beside her, his large hands hovering over her, unsure of where to touch. "Are you hurt?" She was cradling her right wrist against her chest, her face pale and tight in the faint starlight. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a gasp. She nodded, tears of pain and frustration welling in her eyes. The lost water felt like a greater injury than the one to her arm. "It is my wrist," she finally managed, her voice a thin whisper. "I think I have damaged it badly." He gently took her good arm. "Come on, back to the house." He helped her to her feet, his strength a solid presence beside her. She leaned on him, the world swimming slightly around her. He retrieved the lantern from the porch and led her to the steps, his movements careful and sure. He sat her down on the top step of the porch, the familiar wood a small comfort. He brought the lantern closer, its yellow light casting long, dancing shadows. In the warm glow, he could see her wrist was already beginning to swell, a puffy, angry discoloration spreading across the delicate skin. He swore softly under his breath. He touched her arm just above the injury, his fingers incredibly gentle for a man whose hands were so calloused and strong. "Can you move your fingers?" She tried, a fresh wave of pain making her hiss. She could only manage a slight, feeble twitch. "It is sprained," he said, his voice grim, "a bad one." He stood up, his mind working. "Stay here, do not move." He disappeared into the dark cabin and returned a moment later with a small bowl, a strip of clean cloth, and his tobacco pouch. He went to the edge of the porch where a tough, scrubby sagebrush grew, its leaves a dusty silver in the lantern light. He crushed a handful of the leaves into the bowl, their sharp, medicinal scent filling the air. He added a pinch of tobacco and a few drops of water from the drinking barrel, mixing it into a thick, dark paste with his finger. He knelt in front of her again. "This will help with the swelling," he said quietly. "It is what my father used for horse liniment, but it works for people too." He gently took her injured hand, his thumb resting on her palm, his fingers supporting her arm. With his other hand, He carefully applied the cool, pungent poultice to her swollen wrist, spreading it over the tender skin. His touch was focused and professional, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched his face in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that held a world of weariness and a surprising gentleness. In this small, quiet act of care, the vast, empty space that had always existed between them seemed to shrink, to dissolve into the warm, fragrant air of the summer night. "Now for a splint," he said, looking around. His eyes landed on the old saddle he kept on a rack just inside the barn door. He disappeared again and returned with his knife and a long, pliable strap of latigo leather. He cut 2 flat, even pieces, each about the length of her forearm. He soaked them in the water barrel until they were soft, then knelt before her once more. He placed 1 piece of leather under her forearm and 1 on top, sandwiching her arm between them. He took a long, thinner strip of leather and began to wrap it, starting at her elbow. "This will be tight," he warned. He worked his way down her arm, his movements precise. He needed to find the exact point of the sprain, the place where the support would do the most good. As he neared her wrist, he began to press with his thumb, adjusting the tension of the leather, his eyes fixed on her face, watching for any sign. "Here," he asked, his thumb pressing into a spot just below the main swelling. She had been holding her breath, steeling herself against the throbbing pain, but when his thumb found that precise spot, a strange thing happened. A sharp, electric jolt of pain shot through her, but it was followed instantly by a deep, profound wave of relief, as if he had finally located the very center of her hurt and was now holding it steady. The pent-up tension in her body released in a sudden, shuddering rush of air. "Oh God, right there." The words were a breathless, involuntary whisper, half sigh, half prayer. It was the sound of a pain so deep it could finally be named, a burden so heavy it could finally be set down. He looked up from his work, his face just inches from hers. A slow, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth, a smile of pure, unadulterated warmth that reached his eyes. "I found you," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. And in that moment, she knew he was not just talking about the sprain. He was talking about the hidden, broken place inside her, the one she had kept guarded for so long. He had found it. He had seen it, and he was not turning away. His fingers tightened over her hand then, securing the final wrap of the leather. His grip was not a lover's caress. It was something else, something more fundamental. It was a strong, solid pressure, a handshake of absolute certainty. His calloused fingers pressed into hers with a firmness that felt like the roots of an old tree, a force as steady and undeniable as the distant, rolling thunder they sometimes heard from the mountains on a summer evening. It was a grip that did not ask, but stated. It said, "I am here." It said, "You are not alone." It said, "We will hold." He finished tying off the leather, and the splint was complete. It was a crude, homemade thing, but it held her wrist with a firm, comforting security. He released her hand, and the moment of intense connection passed, leaving a warm, vibrating stillness in its wake. They sat in silence for a long time on the porch steps, 2 weary figures in the lantern light. The world of their struggle, the parched field, the dwindling creek, the impossible debt was still there, waiting for them just beyond the circle of light. But something essential had shifted between them. The unspoken had been acknowledged. Maggie flexed the fingers of her good hand, then looked at the splint on her other arm. A small smile played on her lips. "You missed your calling. Jack Turner," she said, her voice soft and a little husky. "You should have been a doctor." He let out a short, tired laugh. "A cowboy's medicine is mostly just stubbornness and leather," he replied, leaning back on his elbows. "Seems I have got plenty of both." As he spoke, a low, distant rumble echoed from the far-off peaks. It was not loud, just a faint vibration in the still night air. It was not rain, not yet, but it was the promise of it. A small, hopeful signal from a world that had, for a moment, shown them its gentler side. They sat and listened, watching the heat lightning flicker silently on the horizon. 2 people no longer just surviving side by side, but bound together by the quiet, powerful language of care. The promise of rain in the distant thunder had been a liar. The sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue, and the heat pressed down on the south field, turning the air to a visible shimmer. The barley stalks were brittle, their heads heavy with grain that was ripening too fast, drying out on the stem. The beans in their pods were beginning to shrink. They were losing the race. "We have to cut now," Jack said one morning, his voice grim as he crumbled a dry barley head in his palm. "Another week of this and there will be nothing left but straw." Maggie looked at the vast field, her good hand shielding her eyes against the glare. The splint on her other wrist was a constant reminder of their last desperate effort. "It is too soon." "It is our only chance," he countered. "We will lose some of the yield, but something is better than nothing." Josiah and his sons agreed. They arrived the next morning before sunrise, their scythes honed to a razor's edge. The work began in the cool, pre-dawn gray, the rhythmic swish of the long blades the only sound in the still air. They worked with a desperate, furious energy, cutting the stalks and laying them in neat rows to be gathered. Maggie, her wrist still too tender for heavy work, raked the cut barley into sheaves, her movements careful but efficient. Lily watched from her blanket in the sliver of shade cast by the wagon, a small, quiet spectator to their frantic battle against time. By midday, the air began to change. The relentless blue of the sky softened to a sickly yellow-gray at the horizon. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, began to shift and gust, picking up small dust devils that danced across the baked earth. "Dust storm," Josiah muttered, his weathered face grim as he looked to the west. "A bad one, by the looks of it." Within the hour, they saw it coming. It was not a cloud, but a solid, roiling wall of brown that swallowed the mountains and blotted out the sun. It advanced on them with a low, menacing rumble, a moving mountain of dirt and grit. The world grew dark, an eerie, unnatural twilight descending in the middle of the afternoon. "Get the cut grain to the wagon!" Jack yelled over the rising roar of the wind. The next hour was a blur of chaotic, choking labor. The wind hit them with physical force, tearing at their clothes and whipping the cut barley from their hands. The air became thick, a suffocating cloud of dust that stung their eyes, clogged their nostrils, and coated their tongues with grit. They worked blindly, stumbling through the brown gloom, their lungs burning with every breath. It was in the midst of this pandemonium that they arrived. 3 riders emerged from the swirling dust like apparitions, their forms dark and indistinct until they were nearly upon them. It was Owen Calder, flanked by the banker, Mr. Harris, and the thin, silent Mr. Evans. Calder sat on his fine black horse, a silk scarf tied over his nose and mouth, his eyes cold and contemptuous as he surveyed the desperate scene. He waited until Jack had heaved a final armful of barley onto the wagon before he spoke, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "A valiant effort, Turner, but it appears both you and the heavens have failed." Jack straightened up, his face a mask of dirt and sweat. He wiped a grimy forearm across his eyes. "Our agreement stands until the harvest is in. Calder." Calder laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Circumstances have changed. This pathetic yield will not cover the debt, and I have grown tired of waiting." He dismounted, his polished boots sinking into the dust. "I have a new offer. I will take this entire harvest, what little there is of it, and you will sign over an additional portion of next year's crop as well, double the original amount." "That is insane," Jack said, his voice a low growl. Josiah and his sons had stopped their work, gathering behind Jack, their scythes held loosely in their hands, their faces hard and grim. "It is business," Calder replied smoothly, "and I am not finished. Your living arrangement here has become a town scandal. It is an affront to decency. As a stakeholder in the bank that holds your note, I cannot have my investments associated with such impropriety. Unless you agree to my terms, I will have Mr. Evans here serve you with a notice of public nuisance, and we will have the sheriff seal this house tomorrow." The threat was a vicious, calculated blow, aimed not at the land, but at the fragile home they had built. It was then that Maggie stepped forward. The wind whipped her skirt around her ankles and tore strands of hair from her bun, but she stood as steady as a rock. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and burning with a cold fire. "You will do nothing of the sort. Mr. Calder," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a strange, clear authority over the storm. Calder turned his sneer on her. "And what will you do to stop me, widow?" "I will tell the truth," she said. From the deep pocket of her apron, she produced her leather-bound journal. "I will tell them how my husband, Thomas, warned you about the support timbers at the Silver Ace. It is all written here, the dates, his words, your dismissals." Calder's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "A grieving woman's fantasies. No one will believe you." "Perhaps not," she agreed, her voice still even. "But perhaps they will believe this." She walked to the wagon, and from under a tarp, she pulled out the rotted section of timber, the one with the stamp. She held it out. "This is a beam from your own supply company, S.A.M.S., the same company that sold the lumber for the mine. It is rotten to the core. Mr. Calder, just like the timbers that killed my husband and 6 other men." Harris and Evans exchanged a nervous glance. Calder's face had gone pale beneath the layer of dust. He took a step back, his arrogance beginning to crack. "That is old scrap wood. It proves nothing," he snarled. "It proves you cut corners," Maggie said, "and I have someone else who can prove it, too." She turned her head and called out toward the barn. "Tomas, it is time." A figure emerged from the barn, blinking in the dusty gloom. He was a small, stooped man with haunted eyes. Jack recognized him as one of the miners who had left town shortly after the collapse. It was Tomas Ortega. "This man, Tomas Ortega, worked with my husband," Maggie announced, her voice ringing with conviction. "He was there when the rotten timbers were installed. He heard Thomas argue with the foreman. He saw you. Mr. Calder, personally sign off on the shipment. He has been silent because he was afraid you would do to him what you did to the others. But he is not afraid anymore." Calder was cornered. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief. "This is absurd. A farce conducted in a dust storm." "Then let us take it to the town." A new voice boomed. The Reverend Miller, on his way to check on a sick parishioner, had been drawn by the confrontation and had heard the last of it. His buggy stopped a short distance away. "This is a matter for the community to hear." The world seemed to pivot in that moment. The impromptu court of the dusty field was moving to the chapel. Word spread through the wind-whipped town with the speed of a prairie fire. By the time they all gathered in the small church, it was packed. Farmers, merchants, and their wives, their faces smudged with dust, filled the pews. The air was thick with tension and the smell of the storm. They stood at the front, before the altar. Jack stood solid and unmoving beside Maggie. Calder stood with his 2 men, his composure regained, his face a mask of offended dignity. Maggie told her story again, her voice never wavering. She read from her journal. She presented the rotted wood. Then Tomas Ortega, his voice shaking but clear, told of the cracked beams, the foreman's threats, and Calder's greed. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the chapel. The townspeople looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. Calder began to speak, his smooth voice dripping with condescension, dismissing it all as the lies of a disgraced miner and a hysterical woman. It was then that a woman stood up from the pews. It was Martha Gable, the deacon's wife, the same woman who had whispered so cruelly about Maggie outside the general store. Her face was stern, her mouth set in a firm line. "I have been one of the worst," she said, her voice loud and clear, silencing Calder in mid-sentence. "I have spread the gossip, I have passed the judgment, and I was wrong." She looked directly at Maggie. "Last week, my best milk cow was in labor for 2 days. The calf was breeched. The veterinarian was in the next county. I was sure I was going to lose them both." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Turner came for supplies, and he heard of my trouble. And an hour later, this woman, Maggie Rowe, showed up at my barn. She stayed with me all night. With that splint on her own wrist, she reached in and she turned that calf with her good arm. She saved them both. She did not ask for payment. She did not ask for thanks. She just did what was right. Martha's gaze swept across the crowded room. Character is not what is whispered in a store. It is what is done in a muddy birthing stall at midnight when no one is looking. I believe her. A murmur went through the crowd, a tide of opinion turning. As Martha sat down, the first heavy drop of rain struck the chapel roof with a loud crack, as loud as a gunshot. It was followed by another, and then the sky opened up. The distant thunder they had heard for weeks had finally arrived, and it came with a roar. Rain fell in a solid, deafening curtain, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof and streamed down the windows, washing the dust from the air. The sound was a roar of absolution. It was a cleansing. It was an end to the drought. Amid the sound of the deluge, the town council chairman stood. In light of this testimony, the town of Dry Willow is suspending the bank's claim on the Turner property. We will be turning over this evidence and our recommendation for a full investigation to the county judge. Calder, his face ashen, turned without a word and stalked out of the chapel into the driving rain, his two men scurrying after him like wet rats. Later, soaked to the bone but unbowed, Jack and Josiah measured out the barley in the clean, rain-washed air. Jack insisted on it. He gave the bank's representative a full half of the salvaged harvest, fulfilling his end of the original bargain. It was a meager amount, but miraculously, what remained was just enough to clear the old Kansas debt. As the storm began to subside, the thunder rumbling its retreat into the mountains, Jack walked to the side of the cabin. He came back carrying a long, new plank of wood. Carved deep into its surface were the words Turner and Rowe Ranch. He held it up for Maggie to see. She looked from the sign to his face, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across hers. Together, in the steady, life-giving rain, with the sound of thunder as their witness, they hung the sign over the door of the cabin, nailing their new beginning firmly into place. The 3 years that followed the dust storm were seasons of quiet, steady work. The rain that had washed the sky clean had also seemed to wash the poison from the town's heart, and a gentle peace settled over the valley. The ranch, once a place of stark survival, became a place of life. It was the spring of 1882. A girl of 4, quick and bright as a hummingbird, chased a yellow butterfly across the new grass of the south field. Her name was Lily, and her laughter was the ranch's truest harvest. She moved in a constant, joyful blur, her dark hair flying behind her, a small, vibrant testament to a life that had almost been lost. On the porch of the cabin, a woman sat in the repaired rocking chair, its motion now a smooth, comforting rhythm. Her name was Maggie, and the gentle swell of her belly beneath her calico dress held the promise of a new season, a new life. She watched her daughters dance with the butterfly, a soft, contented smile on her face. Her wrist, now fully healed, bore a faint, pale line on the skin where the leather splint had once been, a small scar marking a profound turning point. At the edge of the yard, near the sturdy new fence, a man was on his knees, his hands deep in the rich, dark earth. His name was Jack. He was carefully tamping the soil around the roots of a young apple sapling. It was a small, hopeful-looking thing, its thin branches holding a few delicate, white blossoms that trembled in the breeze. Lily, abandoning her butterfly, darted over to him. "What is it, Papa?" she asked, her voice as clear as a bell. Jack looked up, his face breaking into a rare, full smile. The lines of grief that had once been etched so deeply around his eyes had softened into the creases of a man who knew how to laugh again. "This is an apple tree. Little squirrel, a white apple tree." He gently took her small hand and placed it on the sapling's slender trunk. "We are planting it today. Your mama, you, and me. We will watch it grow, and every spring, when it blossoms just like this, it will be a promise. It will be a promise that our love is still alive and growing, just like this tree." Lily looked from the tree to her mother on the porch and back again, her young mind grasping not the words but the feeling behind them. She patted the tree's trunk gently, as if blessing it. Later that afternoon, While Lily was napping and Jack was in the barn mending a harness, Maggie found herself tidying the small wooden box that held her most precious things. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of faded letters from her mother, was a single, folded sheet of paper. It was worn soft at the creases from being opened and refolded many times. She sat on the edge of the bed and carefully unfolded it. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were as powerful as the day they were written. Stay, not a helper, a mother. She ran her finger over the words, the memory of that cold, desperate night in the barn as vivid as yesterday. She remembered the shame, the feeling of being an imposter in another woman's life. And she remembered the solid wall of his back as he shielded her from the wind, the comforting weight of his coat, and the simple, profound truth of his words, "You gave my daughter back to me." She thought of Lily, of her bright, inquisitive spirit, of the small arms that wrapped so tightly around her neck each morning. She thought of the new life stirring within her, a life conceived not in desperation or sorrow, but in a quiet, steady love that had been built day by day, chore by chore, season by season. She whispered the words to the empty room, a final acknowledgement of her long journey out of the dark. The child saved me, and so I chose to stay. The echoes of their past had not vanished completely, but they had changed their tune. Owen Calder had been exposed. The county judge, armed with the testimony of Tomas Ortega and a dozen other miners who had found their courage, had launched a full investigation into the Silver Ace mine. The last they had heard, Calder had sold his stake in the bank and left the state, a disgraced man running from the ghosts he had created. When the matter had been settled, the county had offered Maggie a substantial sum in compensation, a widow's restitution for the negligence that had cost her so much. But she had refused the money. Instead, in a clear, steady voice, she had stood before the council and made a different request. She asked that the money be used to establish a fund to improve the safety of the mine, to ensure that no other woman would have to endure what she had. It was an act of grace that cemented her place in the community's heart, an act that valued humanity over personal gain. The town itself had made its own quiet restitution. The whispers had long since died, replaced by respectful nods and friendly greetings. Martha Gable, the deacon's wife, now stopped by every few weeks with a freshly baked pie and a list of questions about crop rotation. Several other farmers had visited, hats in hand, to ask Jack if he would show them the design for the silt-catching screen that had saved his crop. Their shared struggles with the land had become a bridge, mending the fences of gossip and judgment. They were no longer outsiders. They were neighbors. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long golden shafts of light across the valley, Jack came out of his workshop. In his hand, he held a small carving knife and a block of wood. He walked over to the sign that hung above their door, the one that read, "Turner and Rowe Ranch." The letters were carved deep and clear, a declaration of their partnership, but it was not quite finished. With Maggie watching from the porch, her hand resting on her belly, Jack stood on a stool and began to work. He used the tip of his knife to carefully add a small, elegant flourish to the sign. It was an ampersand, a graceful, looping symbol that he carved into the space between their names. It was not Turner and Rowe anymore. It was two names, two lives, two families, joined into one. He finished his work and stepped back to admire it. The sign was complete now. It was perfect. He looked over at Maggie, and their eyes met across the yard. No words were needed. Everything that mattered was right here, in the rich earth that held their new tree, in the sturdy cabin that was their home, in the laughing child sleeping soundly inside, and in the promise of the new life yet to come. The life they had chosen to build, together. It was a life born not of blood, but of choice. A family forged not by law, but by the daily, unwavering act of staying. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.